Thank you very much, Jill, for that kind introduction, and also I want to thank the C Center for giving me the opportunity to be here and to interact with all of you. I've spoken to many of the faculty, also to people from other faculties here, from the business school in particular, and to some of your students and PhD students. So it's really great to interact and find out the richness of kind of what you're all up to here, the stuff that's going on. It's really impressive and inspiring for me. I hope you can get my accent. I'm Dutch, so I'll just talk a little bit so you can get used to my Dutch accent. I'm a practitioner in residence, as they call it here at the C Center, which means I'm a practitioner. Yet I'm based at a university, and that might be confusing for some of you, because this is a university. I've put it on the map here. It's a place called Wageningen, and I think Jill was very brave in trying to pronounce it. Anybody else wants to give a try? We say Wageningen, or Wageningen. And that's it's basically a very small town. There's only 35,000 people living there, and it has a university with 10,000 students. So you can imagine what a strange bubble that must be. Yet it's like Denver. It's also a very international community with lots of PhDs from over 100 countries, etc. So you might not have heard of that university because it's a very specialized university in life sciences. It's traditionally an agricultural university, and in the world of academia and agriculture, it's actually quite a famous place. And I think it's consistently in the top 3 of universities in the field of agriculture worldwide. We usually compete with UC Davis and with Cornell University, and then there's Wageningen. But even in the Netherlands, a lot of people have difficulty pointing out Wageningen on the map because we are so small. And internationally, in certain sectors, I think more people seem to know Wageningen, even though they can't pronounce it. And yeah, just a very little story. Our prime minister, which is like a president in our country. We're a kingdom, but we have also a prime minister, of course, who leads the administration. And he was on a trade mission to China, and he was sitting at a banquet next to the mayor of Beijing. And so the mayor asked him, "Oh, Prime Minister, where did you study?" And so he answered, "I studied in Rotterdam Business School," which is, of course, Rotterdam is a big city and the business school is renowned. So the mayor looked a little bit like, "Oh, Rotterdam? How far is that from Wageningen?" So that is like a little bit of an indication of what Wageningen has for a reputation outside. There's another thing I should tell you about this university is that it's a merger between a university like Denver and about 9 research institutes. So there's also a lot of contract research and other applied type of research taking place. And that merger allows for a lot of cross-collaboration and cross-fertilization of ideas. So I'm based at the Center for Development Innovation, which is one of those institutes, which means that I don't teach to students. What's another thing? I hardly published in peer-reviewed magazines or journals. Rather, I do kind of action research together with partners or with clients. I give policy advice, I do evaluations of programs, and I do a lot of capacity building, which means giving training to mid-career professionals. So they either come to Wageningen or I go to other places where I work with those people. For example, we have a 3-week course in Wageningen on how to design and facilitate multi-stakeholder partnerships. And that's a course that we offer every year, and it's attended usually by 20, 30 people from all over the world. And that's the type of experience that I'm drawing from when I speak to you today. So I'm not going to talk a lot about some of the theoretical underpinnings of all the work, although it's there, and we can discuss that later. But I've also been requested to tell you a little bit about the practice and about how things really work if you interact with different stakeholders, how it is like to work together with business, with NGOs, with the public sector, sometimes with the UN. So I can give you a couple of insights on that, and some of the stuff that we've learned and that we teach in our courses I will share with you. There's another thing I should perhaps tell you up front is that I will also give some examples. I will try to be as specific as possible with my examples. but there may be a couple of examples which I will tell you anonymous, because I think I've learned a lot of things about from working directly with partners, and that I've been privileged in that position, but it also the confidence that these partners have placed upon me also depends a little bit on not hanging the dirty laundry outside, so to speak. And it also has the benefit that I can tell you what really happens rather than give you a bland story about the World Bank or something like that. You know, I can. So I'm not going to give examples of the World Bank. No. I saw some people thinking, oh, there's a hole here behind me. So, okay. So Wageningen. This is what our campus looks like, more or less. Yeah, so we can't compete with Denver because we don't have that backdrop of mountains. As you know, the Netherlands is a very, very flat country, and 2/3 of our country is below sea level. Here you can see a couple of things about the university, our mission statement, and also the type of things that we do as a Center for Development Innovation. So we're actually a very practical unit based at the university, drawing in expertise from our academic colleagues as much as we can. So that's also kind of a benefit that we offer compared to other consulting firms, perhaps. On the bottom of the slides, you will see some information about myself, but I won't go into that because Jill already kindly summarized a lot of it. Yeah, as Jill mentioned, I try to divide my time a little bit between working with different types of partners. And the reason why I do that is that I've discovered over the years that I'm quite a good border crosser, which means that if I work with the public sector, I'm really happy, but at a certain moment I get irritated or bored or, you know, not happy. If I work with NGOs, same. If I work with companies, same. But if I'm kind of in the middle and act as a person who can connect these different sectors, then I'm at my most happy. And I also think that for the type of work that I do in international development, it's really helpful to have people who speak different languages, corporate language, NGO language, and so on. It doesn't mean that I'm agnostic towards any kind of particular stance. I do have my own opinion about land rights or about land grabbing, for example. And sometimes I also get into trouble with that because some of the people I work with in these partnerships, they have very different ideas than I have. And sometimes that's, for me personally, there's a bit of soul searching. How far is my responsibility to facilitate these people to collaborate better? Because that's what I try to do. And also in trying to kind of stay close to my own convictions about what I think is needed in order to end land grabbing or to improve human rights in a certain context. Yeah, so there's also some personal ethical dilemmas that maybe I will speak about. But as you can see at the bottom, I do work with NGOs. I do work with governments as well. I've said some companies, but actually at the moment there's not that much companies that I'm working for. There's just, I don't know why, but it's maybe at a certain moment historically certain people tend to hire you more or tend to engage you more. And I do work a lot with companies, but it's not the companies that hire me. It's usually paid for by governments to kind of engage with companies, funny enough. One more thing about the Netherlands. Any of you who have been to the Netherlands by any chance? Can I see your hands? Wow, that's almost half. Great. Now you will, the whole idea of working collaboratively really sits well with kind of the Dutch culture, so to speak. It's both in the way how our political system is designed and also how people in general kind of get on with life. And people often attribute this to the fact that we are a country below water and that we've got continuous concerns about getting flooded and that we needed to collaborate across boundaries, even with the people that we didn't like or that we are at war with, in order to survive. So there's this kind of ingrained notion that, yeah, you can hate somebody, but still you will find a way to collaborate with that person in order to not get flooded. So that's, I actually don't know if the term to polder means anything to you, but in Dutch it's become a verb about how to do things. I'm not saying it's a perfect method. It also has a lot of weaknesses. A lot of our decision making goes extremely slow. and a lot of our decisions are perhaps also suboptimal because of that. But that just gives you an idea where I come from and the type of experience that I bring, and that I've kind of tried to also, to test with people in completely different parts of the world. And as a matter of fact, a lot of my practical experience I've learned from other people. And if you will have the ability to have a look at the book that I wrote, a lot of the tools and a lot of the ideas actually come from experience from NGOs and activists in India about participatory rural appraisal, for example. That's a particular methodology on how to kind of do research together with farmers or with communities. So it's not all kind of a Dutch projection of the world or Dutch knowledge that we try to export. No, it's not like that. But it's a very important part of my makeup and of the thing that I probably, an experience that I bring that might be of use. Good. Now I'd like to dive into the topic of multi-stakeholder partnerships and what we mean with that. We've deliberately chosen not for a very academic definition, but for a very, very broad definition. And I've put up a couple of terms that you will often see. And quite often they connect or they refer to the type of collaborative processes that we call multi-stakeholder partnerships. So you might recognize some of them, perhaps not. And in some sectors, people like to talk about innovation labs. Other people talk more about, I think here in the US, you've got quite a big movement around collective impact, for example. In other countries, they talk more about stakeholder dialogues, etc. So all these terms kind of have kind of the same idea behind it. Just one definition that I could offer that I've chosen just because of its simplicity is a definition talking about a collaboration or cooperation arrangement between a variety of actors that jointly engage in a process of dialogue and action to solve a specific problem. So that's still a very wide definition. It doesn't tell you in what way it's organized, what the legal form it takes, etc. But it gives you a little bit of an idea what are some of the key ingredients. Now, the book that I wrote is actually, I wrote it with these mid-career professionals in mind that we often get in our courses or that we work with. So sometimes they are directors of NGOs, sometimes they are heads of department of a government in Bangladesh or Kenya or wherever. Sometimes they are staff of the World Bank or of a UN organization. Sometimes they're people working in embassies or working with civil servants in public service. So, of course, we try to kind of use some academic ideas and base it and do some referencing, but we knew that people wouldn't read it if it would be full of references, and it also would also, so we aimed for kind of a broader audience and keep it relatively light. The reason why we wrote the book is that we see that everybody in the last decade seems to be talking about partnerships and about collaborative processes as a way to solve some of the more pressing, complex social and ecological and economic and security challenges. Yet, in practice, we see a lot of people struggle enormously with their partnerships. And it's like, we've discovered it's really easy to start up a partnership or an initiative. But you should, just for fun, if you try to kind of look at partnerships that have started 2-3 years ago and you go to their websites, and sometimes you can see from the website, either the Twitter feed is kind of dead, or kind of the last update or blog is from 10 months ago. So then already you've got an indication that, perhaps people started with something, but it doesn't seem to take off, or they're struggling somewhere. That's what we often see. So the reason for me to kind of document some of these experiences is that I felt, the potential of partnerships is there. It's also recognized by people. If you go on the UN level, you will also know that in the new SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the idea of working in partnerships is like kind of cross-cutting, and it's everywhere. It's not only goal number 17, but it's also in all of the other goals, it is embedded somehow as a strategy to achieve those goals, which means that there's an enormous belief or expectation being placed on partnerships to deliver something. And we don't have the scientific evidence yet that it will deliver. And we also, in practice, we see people struggling. So on the other hand, I've also seen a lot of really interesting initiatives, a lot of interesting multi-stakeholder processes that have delivered results. So it's not, it's a mixed bag really. So we've tried to figure out, what in the mixed bag is really valuable and can be applied to other sectors or arenas and can be scaled, and what is perhaps not. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'll give you 3 examples just to kind of get us started a little bit, and also to give you a little bit of a picture about some of the programs that I've worked with, or that some of my colleagues have worked with. Because I'm basically part of a team of about 10 people who are doing this type of stuff in the Netherlands. So I'm representing the team in a certain way. Now, my first example is an example from Nigeria. And I've written it up in the book as well. You will probably know that Nigeria is very famous or infamous for a lot of its environmental disasters caused by the oil industry. And this was a particular example, I won't go into all the details, but about a community in Ogoniland which is heavily affected by oil spills. Basically what happens is that there's these big oil pipelines from international oil companies all going to the coast. These oil pipelines, they tend to leak and cause kind of a spillage of crude oil. Yet the oil companies say, yeah, there are leaks, but there's also vandalism by local people kind of drilling holes into these big pipelines and tapping it and then refining it in a very kind of unprofessional way and causing a lot of environmental damage in the process. So that for years, it's been back and forth between communities blaming Shell and Shell blaming the communities and the federal government basically not knowing what to do, doing nothing. The story that I'm telling here is a story about a group of environmental NGOs together with a Dutch ambassador. And this Dutch ambassador is, I've interviewed him for the book, and he's got a really inspiring story, how he, together with the director of this environmental NGO, how he set up a process of dialogue between all these different parties. And you may think, well, what's the Dutch ambassador got to do with it? Well, Shell is a Dutch Anglo company, so there's an interest from the Netherlands. But at the same time, the Dutch government or the Dutch international aid program had for already many years supported environmental NGOs. So they had kind of good relationships with both. And somehow they figured out, well, it seems that we're probably the only ones that are trusted by everybody because of our being Dutch and also being relatively small. Yeah. So it's a story of a couple of years kind of negotiating and fighting, starting with a situation where these different stakeholders didn't even want to be in the same room, then gradually being able to sit in the same room, but then not side by side like you're sitting, but there would be kind of the company representatives here, the environmental people there, and the community people over there, not speaking to each other. And the story, there's some interesting kind of details of the story that I really, really learned a lot from. For example, just a very small one, the importance of, or the disruptive role that lawyers can play in such processes. And at a certain moment, everybody had brought their high-profile lawyers. Also, the environment, you have different environmental NGOs, and there were some very militant ones that had brought their own high-profile lawyers. And of course, the company brought a battery of lawyers. And the people who were facilitating this was not myself, but this was actually from a group in Geneva called the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. They worked with that whole group for half a day, and after lunch they kicked out all the lawyers. And then things started to get moving. There's a lot of interesting lessons. Well, the bottom line of this story is that after all those years, I think a process of 2-3 years or so. Shell offered a settlement of about 70 million euro, which is about 80-90 million dollars. There's a cleanup operation underway, internationally monitored to good quality standards, and there's a community development kind of fund which helps to rebuild the livelihoods of all the fishermen and farmers that were affected by all these oil spills. Of course, that's only in one area of Nigeria. There's many other areas where the same problems are still there and where they're still not really being tackled. But when you go back to some of these stakeholders, they say, well, of course, now we've got not only the money from Shell and the recognition for our problem, and we've got a cleanup campaign and we've got some money, but we also have an ongoing structure in which we can talk to all these stakeholders. We've got relationships, and if there's a problem, we can just immediately convene again. So there's a certain type of capital that's been built up in the process that kind of is going beyond kind of the duration of this particular negotiation. So this is an example of a multi-stakeholder partnership that starts with a huge conflict. There's of course also a lot of other partnerships, and this is my second small story. This is about Ethiopia, where it's basically about, it's an agricultural case. This is about the seed sector. Of course, any farmer needs good quality input seeds. What if you can't get them? Or if they're only available at prices you can't afford, kind of delivered by multinational companies who deliver seeds, as we know. So this was basically a story of bringing all these stakeholders together, particularly the local ones, and recognizing that for them it was not a matter of, we just need more money, then we can buy the seeds, but also a matter of, locally we've got very good quality seeds. So we don't want to be overtaken by foreign seeds and become dependent on those companies. So, but there was no possibility legally for local farmers to kind of market that seed, to put it on the market. There was no quality assurance, there was no legal framework for that, etc. So eventually, some of my colleagues helped this group of stakeholders over the course of, I think, 3 or 4 years to not only kind of experiment together, which was not only the farmers and do experimentation, but bring farmers there, bring local business there, get the government in, get some of the research institutes in, and create these small innovation platforms, and just facilitate those groups to do things together, to encourage partnering, and also to encourage kind of testing, experimenting, innovating together. So they come up with a couple of really feasible ideas, which eventually led to the law being adapted, and now cooperatives are able to sell their locally made seed to the market, and there's a whole system in place that allows it. So this is not a story like a victory of the small farmer over kind of big agribusiness, because the whole system of seed, it has also the big companies do have a place in that, but it's now a much more kind of balanced arrangement in which also smallholders have created space for their own local markets, etc. My third example is an example I haven't been involved in myself, but I've just put it in because I know here at the Sea Center, this is also an initiative that is kind of high on your, you probably encounter it a lot. This kind of initiative, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, that was set up by governments, companies, and civil society organizations. It's like a global multi-stakeholder initiative. And what they do is, they've got the shared belief that natural resource wealth should benefit citizens and not just become, so that transparency is actually a way to increase the kind of the tax revenues of extractive industries. So they've been operating in 52 countries, if I'm right, and have led to some very, very solid results in companies becoming more transparent. And actually the International Secretariat of this initiative is also co-funded by companies. So there's NGOs involved, governments, they see that this is kind of helping them to fill a particular governance need. But also companies themselves, they see that this is a way to raise the bar for the whole sector. So this is all about gas, oil, minerals. Now I want to focus a little bit on what happens when you get these different stakeholders in a room. And first of all, you need to recognize that there's a lot of different preconceptions and assumptions that all these stakeholders have about each other. And I'm just going to put some of them on this sheet, and you will perhaps recognize it. So for example, if we look at government, you see that if people talk about government or the public sector, they think, government, bureaucratic, dogmatic, controlling. So there's all these ideas, and partly they're true. So I'm not saying that they're just assumptions and we should debunk them. I'm saying that these are in the heads of other sectors. And sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not. And somehow you need to kind of work and test and expose some of these assumptions in order for people to really have a fruitful dialogue. So that's step one that you need to overcome. For business, if you think about business, what comes to mind? Profit-driven, quick fix. Here's a couple of things that people mention when you think about private sector. Same for donors, for the UN. Arrogant. You recognize some of these? I see some people nodding. Yeah, Ollie?
So, what if these might be misconceptions, but what if these are true?
Mm-hmm.
And people are just finding out, they actually believe these things, and that's actually how they behave. I mean, I guess there's some wiggle room, but
yeah, there's some wiggle room.
what if you're just reinforcing these, the government is really slow, and
Yeah, I've been in a lot of situations where actually the conclusion was that people's assumptions are reconfirmed. Yeah. But I've also learned that it's sometimes good to kind of separate kind of the institution or the institutional culture from the people that you're dealing with. Because sometimes you will see that whether it's in the corporate sector or the public sector, the people that reach out or work in partnerships, they're the people who are on the outskirts of that organizational culture. And they're also more open to other behaviors or other practices. So instead of immediately kind of condemning them because of these ideas, you might be surprised to find out how these people are actually different. Even though, if they go back to their institutions, they often deal with that stuff. Indeed, about communities, we've also have people recognize some of these things. Yeah. Lazy, uneducated, difficult, hot-tempered. And NGOs, of course, when NGOs enter the arena, then also there's immediately a lot of ideas about NGOs. Unprofessional, point scoring, narrow focus. Recognize them? Basically, my kind of conclusion from this is that if we can't get beneath these stereotypes, there's little chance of building genuine partnerships. And I think that the real capital that you build in partnerships is because people are surprised at how similar other stakeholders often are. It doesn't mean that you have to agree. It doesn't mean that the interests that you represent are not different. Yes, they are different and they are competing, and often they remain competing. But still, you can partner effectively despite those differences, in my experience. Good. The picture that I'm showing you now is like the table of content of the book that I wrote. So this is just telling you a little bit about the why, the what, and the how of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I'm not going to talk much about the why, the kind of the upper part, but I'm going to focus on the blue section, on what a process looks like, a process to kind of form and design and facilitate a multi-stakeholder partnership. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some principles that we identified that tend to help with making MSPs effective. So that's the green part. So that'll be the next part of my presentation. I'll first show you what we call a process model. This is basically kind of what, this is not a scientific model as such. We've just used this to help practitioners kind of reflect on where they are in a certain kind of partnership stage. So if you're in initiating phase, that's where the arrow is, you know, there are certain critical questions you need to ask yourself when you're initiating it. When the thing kind of starts running, you get into an adaptive planning kind of mode. There's also some specific questions that you should ask, and so on. Same for collaborative action and for reflective monitoring. And I'm just going to show you some of the bullets. These are some of the potential questions that you can ask, or some of the issues that you deal with in each of those stages. And we're not saying that every MSP follows these stages in a very kind of dogmatic order, but it's more like generally, you know, their process is bound in time. So you start somewhere, and usually at a certain moment they're either finished, and finishing sometimes means that the process is stopping. Sometimes it means it's evolving into something else. And that's sometimes what success looks like. So, that's an initiative kind of leads to other initiatives. And sometimes if an initiative stops, people feel it's a failure. But sometimes actually initiatives have quite good results, and it's okay for them to kind of dissolve. So let me just give you, I'm not going into all these bullets. This is just to illustrate a little bit, the type of questions that you can ask, and that are kind of detailed a little bit in this guide. Now, let's go to these 7 principles now, and that will probably be kind of the last big piece of my presentation. And you know, feel free to ask questions, but you can also hold them maybe for another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. Now, these, I'll just put them up straight away. We identified 7, and some of them are a little bit more conceptual by nature, and some of them are really, really practical and are more about micro skills, as we call them, that you need to have in place, like good communication skills. That's principle 5. Communication skills, or dealing with conflict. Of course, especially here at this center, there's lots of theories about conflict, but also you need to know how to deal with conflict in a small team, and how to approach that. So let me kind of take them one by one. Now, the first one we've called embracing systemic change. And this is more like a conceptual kind of principle, because we often see that people start partnerships because they want to achieve kind of a really, really practical, tangible goal. And often when we reflect with them on, you know, what are you actually, in which system are you actually trying to intervene, and have you really thought that through, then people often admit that they're just enthusiastic getting started, and they're very passionate about a certain topic. But actually they don't really understand the system in which they're trying to intervene. And in our work, we draw a lot from complex adaptive systems and complexity theory. And I won't go into that right now, but basically a lot of the problems associated with international development are complex problems, which means that you can't solve them in a really linear way. Kind of they evolve in very unpredicted ways. And if you, let me just say one thing about this. In my experience, if you want to kind of take a systemic change perspective on these problems, what we often advise people to do in practice is to first zoom out. You know, so you've got your issue, whether it is human rights in Bangladesh or whatever. Zoom out, analyze this conflict, and not analyze it kind of academically, but just do a quick sweep of who are the stakeholders, where are the power relationships here, what type of institutions kind of impact on the way how this situation has developed and is now constraining development. So do that together with your stakeholders, preferably. And we've got lots of practical tools on how to do that, also drawing from system theory. And so first zoom out, understand that system better, and then zoom in again. Because of course you can't kind of tackle that whole system. And these complex adaptive systems have a habit of not being able to be managed. They're just kind of very unpredictable. It doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do, but you need to know in which niche you're going to place your intervention, and where you then can kind of apply resources, ideas, some pressure or kind of create partnerships in order for something to emerge which kind of changes that complex adaptive system. Yeah. Okay, so zoom out and then zoom in again. And zooming in, then you're probably going to ask, but what do you do if you've identified a certain thing you want to be doing? How do you do it? Then from systems thinking, we know that what's most effective, and also that it's not only system thinking but also business thinking, what's most effective is to do lots of small experiments, collect lots of feedback quickly, and iterate very quickly. So don't kind of plan a 3-year program and then you just kind of plan it out all in detail and then start implementing it slowly. No, just choose maybe 6 or 7 small activities that you think you've got an inkling that it might actually do something in that system or towards solving that problem. And start those 6, 7 activities kind of straight away in parallel and monitor them really quickly and find out, is it working, is it not working? If it's working, you throw more money at it. If it's not working, you kill it off. And that's business logic, but it's really effective in learning fast and getting feedback from that system that you're trying to influence, rather than having the detached analysis that's also needed. Of course, I know I'm here standing in a university where kind of maybe your dream is to have that detached space where you can have unlimited funding and kind of reflect for the rest of your life on problems. But in my world of practice, people are very impatient and they want to engage directly. So it's always a dilemma. How rigorous can my analysis be if I also want to keep these people on board that I'm working with? So yes, we do need academia, but we also need kind of some of the practical knowledge creation processes. And it's perhaps less rigorous, I accept that, but I think both are needed. Okay, so that's about systemic change. Transforming institutions. Now, if we talk about institutions, we use the sociological term, which is institutions are the rules of the game. So an institution is not an organization. It can be, but it's not necessarily. But an institution can also be marriage or money or, for example, gender issues. There's lots of institutions behind it, the rules of the game, how societies operate and function. So we're not suggesting that by just kind of using a particular multi-stakeholder methodology that you can transform an institution, because usually that takes generations. But what we are saying is that quite often we see partnerships that try to tackle something but don't really include in their analysis the role that institutions play in order to keep things as they are, and institutions can actually be a very powerful catalyst of positive change. And we also know, for example, in gender theory, we know that institutions can be a very a hindering force in order to kind of keep in place a very negative situation. So this is transforming institutions means include it in your analysis and try to kind of target those institutions that are actually causing or that are connected to the root causes of the problem. The third one, about power. Work with power means not you try to find the most powerful people you can, then you've got the most kind of leverage and effect. It means that if you work with different stakeholders, you have to recognize that not all of them have the same power, of course. This is obvious. Now, I've often run into troubles because I've been in situations where I've had very powerful stakeholders in the room, ministers or CEOs or what have you. And then at the same time, to really address the issue, you also need the voice of the community, or you need disadvantaged groups to be present and kind of be part of that conversation. Now, I've had some very bad experience in what I call setting people up for failure. And I've been guilty of that. And that's some of my worst memories are of stakeholder meetings where, we just had people in the room, and some of the most kind of clever people, some of the most well-connected people, just blew away all the community representatives that were there. So they were just like token representatives rather than having a meaningful contribution So I learned a lot from that. So if I am talking about working with power, I'm talking about, yes, try to find who is powerful and also use their power to the advantage of the whole initiative, but also try to empower stakeholder groups that are disadvantaged and perhaps not yet capable of meaningfully engaging in that conversation. And there are certain ways how you can do that. Often what I do, that I insist with a particular organization, that if you really want to have, let's say, a certain women's group on board in this initiative, then first I'd like to have a pre-workshop with that women group, so that we can really trash out the issues and make sure that they understand the debate and the environment in which they're going to be talking to people from companies or from the government. And of course that's, perhaps not kind of fully effective, but that's the least that we can do in order to ensure that it's never going to be a level playing field, I'm afraid. It's always going to be a little bit tilted, but at least we're trying our best to kind of make it more even. I think that's also a moral responsibility that I feel personally. Yeah, Ollie?
You gave that first example where you kicked out all the lawyers.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways that might disadvantage these already disadvantaged groups if you're kicking out their sort of advisors or accompaniers, no?
Yeah. Well, first I didn't do that. That was somebody else. But yeah. No, actually, I was engaged in that particular example in working with a stakeholder group, which was the environmental NGOs, in helping them with some action research on basically doing a stakeholder analysis and a power analysis. And with that baggage, they were able to kind of engage in that stakeholder meeting. Yeah, your question is whether it can also disempower. Yeah. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. And sometimes you're not even. But I think that the main point in that particular example is that the lawyers were creating a kind of a fight atmosphere. And what kind of one of the other principles that I'm going to explain and that I'm going to close off with is about communicating effectively. And basically, to summarize it in one word, is try not to aim for debate, but try to aim for dialogue and try to create a platform or a space where you can move from debate to dialogue. So all these lawyers, they were just debating. So that wasn't helping to kind of move to that dialogue kind of space. Does it answer your question? Maybe not, but we'll talk later. Okay. To finish off on the conflict, by the way, conflict is something, if you encounter it, you just want it to go away, right? That's at least how I feel personally. I don't like conflict that much, so if I encounter it, I just want to smooth it, or I want to kind of help to kind of make it disappear. But I've also learned that sometimes conflict can be a very powerful agent of change. And sometimes I've seen some of the strongest partnerships move through a phase of conflict before they were able to really kind of gel together and trust each other and so on. So there's also kind of a slightly different take on conflict. And dealing with conflict, as we've called it, doesn't mean kind of making conflict go away. It means also using the conflict that's there and help, of course, contain it, that it doesn't explode in everybody's face, but also make sure that it can help actually to move the process further. The sixth one is about promoting collaborative leadership. And this one is often misunderstood because I'm not suggesting that everybody is a leader or something like that. In these type of partnerships, you also need a very clear division of roles and responsibilities. But at the same time, where I often see that it's failing is where partnerships are dependent on maybe one or two very active people and other people, are just a little bit passive around it. So collaborative leadership means trying to ensure that leadership responsibilities or that leadership resources are distributed in a wider group of people, stakeholders, or a steering group or something like that. And if you manage to get that done, it has a couple of advantages. First, well, you've got more leadership resources in the room, so more brains, more capacity, more different leadership styles. And secondly, you also have the benefit of having potentially more ownership among different stakeholder groups, because if you arrive at decisions together, you don't run the risk that kind of a small steering group will say, yeah, let's go that way, and then when they communicate to the wider group of stakeholders, then suddenly hell breaks loose, and some stakeholder says, yeah, but I don't agree with that. So there's also a way of increasing the ownership. Enabling effective communication. I couldn't help myself. I put this slide with this is a Cambodian photo. This is in the water festival in October in Cambodia. You've got all these boat races, and each boat represents one village. Maybe you think, what's the link with communication here? Basically, you can imagine that for that boat kind of to row smoothly and fast, you need an awful lot of internal alignment and communication, so that's one. But secondly, you can imagine that what can go wrong if these boats kind of bump into each other. So there's also coordination needed on a different level. So that's the kind of the complexity in communication that you also see in partnerships. Finally, foster participatory learning. Learning for us is not so much about acquiring new skills and education and so on like you do in a class. Learning is also a process of sense making, and that's something that you want to happen in a multi-stakeholder environment where people kind of learn from each other or jointly formulate what are really the kind of the learning questions that we want to focus on for the coming time, and then organize activities that together with mixed groups we'll try to find out what are the data about this. Should we commission a researcher to kind of feed us in on this particular topic? What can we find out ourselves? Is everybody represented on this, or do we really understand what the issue is behind kind of illegal logging in Ghana? So that type of learning processes is not classroom based. It's also not something that you get a certificate for, but it is like almost a culture that you want to get ingrained in your partnership. Right, and I think I'm probably at the end now of my my talk. The good news is that the book that we wrote is an open access book, so if you go to this website you can download it as a full PDF for free. And just a couple of months ago we actually, what we did is in that book we briefly described 60 very practical participatory tools that you can use, either to analyze things together with stakeholders or to facilitate group meetings or whatever. And we've actually written them out a little bit more like a facilitator's guideline, and that's kind of the second book, the tool guide, that's also freely available. And yeah, on the bottom left you see kind of the place where you can get some of that information. Yeah. Well, thanks for listening so far, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. Perhaps some of my work, of some of my agricultural, environmental knowledge is a very different world from the world that you're occupying or the fields that you are studying. But I think over the last week I've learned that there's a lot of commonalities with some of the issues that we're all grappling with, either analytically or just in practice. So thanks for your attention. Okay, Jill, we still have some time, or are we done?
We have a few minutes.
Okay, yeah, good, please.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, it's very interesting. I'm interested in the interaction between these different stakeholders and sort of how you break down hostility. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how important personality is in individual leadership style versus the process that you talk about. So
yeah.
That seems to be very important.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Quite often the way how to overcome a conflict or the way how to move forward as a group with diverse interests is because certain personalities seem to gel. And that's something you can't engineer, because these stakeholders, they will nominate anybody from their own circles, which and sometimes you have to work with a group that is perhaps suboptimal. And in some cases, I've been in situations where I felt that one particular person was so dominant and disruptive that I had to kind of work the back channels to find out if we could ensure that from that stakeholder group there would be either another representative or that at least there would be a second representative, as a way of maybe managing that. And sometimes you're successful, sometimes you aren't. But to answer your question, yes, I think personality is really, really important. And even though you cannot manage that, you can immediately see in a group, after you've worked with them for a couple of hours, if there is a right balance between introverts and extroverts, for example. And I'm not sure if it's on that portal, but I wrote a separate article about whether introverts are better partnership brokers than extroverts. Yeah, I was inspired after reading a book by Susan Cain, the book Quiet. I see some people nodding, knowing it. Yeah, so I'm an introvert myself, so I also wondered, what some of my colleagues who are really extrovert and really good with all that group stuff, and they think on their feet and they're absolutely thriving when they're always with people, are they doing a better job or not? The answer is probably yes, probably introverts. Sorry. Introverts are what most people seem to say is that introverts tend to be better because they listen better. But you need both, right? Yeah. And I think earlier we talked about the Myers-Briggs terminology or the typology. That's a very, I'm sure you've done those tests as well. And that's I think a very useful and reliable kind of way of knowing yourself. And of course, we've also done it in trainings and with sessions that we give people these tests, and they kind of get them to interact about their personalities and stuff. But with some of the more high-level negotiations, you can't go into all that fun and games type of. So you need to be a little bit more serious, and so then it is sometimes really thinking on your feet and trying to make kind of the personality mix work, because that's usually the strongest driver for results. Yeah. Apart from good strategy and good analysis, by the way, because I've also seen really effective groups that were thriving, but were going nowhere basically, because they hadn't figured out their strategy well enough, and they were basically barking up the wrong tree. So in those situations, we often immediately ask them to go back to their original idea and reassemble their theory of change and find out, what were you really thinking, what would happen if you would do this? And what are the assumptions underneath that? And then start to rebuild that theory of change in a way that kind of is a little bit more informed by analysis and by, just to make it a little bit stronger analytically. So that's also needed, besides the personality mix. Other questions, please?
In a situation between a government and a community where there's been a significant amount of mistrust on both sides, can you talk about some examples or some tools to start that trust building where, like you were saying, they don't be in the same room, but they have a history of just negating the other person as any goodwill to that situation?
Yeah. Now, first of all, I think even though we've got a great toolbox and all kinds of methods, I think there's some issues that probably cannot be resolved in these type of partnerships. Some of the divisions and some of the trauma go so deep that it may take generations for people to actually take a next step towards another ethnic group, for example. But yes, I've been in situations where, during the stakeholder meeting, people didn't even want to sit in the same room. So then your role becomes, it was in Uganda somewhere, to pedal back and forth between two rooms in the same hotel, carrying messages. And then gradually in the second day, people bringing them together, or at least they agree to come together. But then still, at both sides of the room and not really kind of interacting with each other. So an answer to your question is yes, there are ways, if you are sensitive about where the mistrust is about, there are ways how you can kind of manage it slowly. And maybe the final thing I will say about it is that you shouldn't overestimate or put too much. Don't expect everything to come from meetings. I think in those situations, I would rather invest in a time where you just have one-to-one meetings with people. And also, I've also been impressed sometimes with people who are just going to meet other people So for example, going on a field visit or an exposure tour, and just kind of meeting people outside of their office, because sometimes if people go outside of their office, they also, there's a lot of the power that they derive from their office and their whole institution that suddenly falls away, and it's just two people meeting each other on a field of corn. And so sometimes you will find out that suddenly they find something in common. And I remember a situation where there was I was expecting a lot of trouble in a certain process from a high military officer. And I thought, you know, if we bring him together with NGOs, what will happen? So I had a sleepless night over that. Now, what actually happened is that all of them arrived at the same hotel the previous evening because there was traveling time involved, and they met kind of over a beer the evening before, and they discovered that they had some hobbies in common, and that actually this was part of the topic which was on the discussion was primary education for children. And actually we found out later that this particular military person, his wife was was a teacher, and he was also in a parent-teacher committee. He was very active, and he was actually in his private time, he was like a big activist for education for children. So sometimes we hadn't done our homework and hadn't figured out who was exactly in the room. We thought, oh, this is a military guy, he'll probably start fighting with the NGOs. But in fact, you know, there was an immediate kind of trust being developed. So sometimes you have these nice surprises, sometimes you have them the opposite way also. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Yes, Fred.
I think the World Economic Forum is dealing quite a bit also with multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think they have now numerous working groups to bring together, of course, large corporations with community interests and NGOs. Have you been able to hook into that or dealing with that? What's your view? Are you aware of these activities?
Yeah.
And what do you think of it?
Yes, I'm aware of it. Some of my colleagues are directly working with the New Vision for Agriculture, which is kind of one of their sectoral programs of the World Economic Forum. And what they're basically trying to do, it is more or less multi-stakeholder, because yes, they do invite also representatives from different sectors into their activities, but it's very much private sector driven.
That's it.
And
Advantage to it.
yes, it does have advantages. What I see happening, both with the World Economic Forum, but also with other initiatives in the agricultural field, like the Sustainable Food Lab, for example, or the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, is that they create spaces for people in the private sector who want to change things. And sometimes I'm not sure if they're really moving forward a real multi-stakeholder negotiation, but I regard them as very precious, because I think we need those spaces where private sector can be inspired, can kind of work together on their sustainability issues or their inclusiveness issues. And I also know that many of the NGOs are, of course, thinking that they're not going far enough. I get that, but I also see the big divide that is there between the private sector and between what activists, what the stance of activists are. So, from my perspective, I think that the World Economic Forum is having a significant contribution in that area, but it's not enough. Yeah, it's not enough. But I'm positive about them doing this, because 10 years ago I don't think there was much convening in that space. And we do see that there's kind of a group of front-runner companies that are really trying to do things differently, and they're not necessarily doing it anymore for reasons of public relationships, of just CSR. You know, just companies, they have the CSR department and they have to kind of do the outreach and the nice fluffy social things, but it doesn't really affect the core business of these companies. I also see that changing with some of these front-runner companies, that they're actually in a lot of the business units in that company, that sustainability is somehow embedded, and that still going slow, but there's some positive developments there, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.